Good afternoon. We really appreciate this opportunity to come before you on this urgent and important topic. I know you've seen a lot of Youth Justice Coalition members before you in the past, and all of us at the YJC have experienced the system firsthand. We've been detained, incarcerated, some deported, and our family members also. But today, the young people that are before you are people that couldn't be here and won't be able to testify before you. And I think that's really important is not only how they live their lives, but also what their deaths can teach us about what it is to be a young man of color struggling to survive in California. 3 of these young people were on probation when they were killed. All of them had been stopped, patted down, and questioned numerous times in their schools and communities by municipal and school police, as well as sheriffs. Suppression didn't redirect their lives. It was there to pick up the pieces once their lives were taken. I'm asking us, as we think about the future that we want for California, to consider going back to the future, to think about where we were in 1980 and how that could be our measure for success. Because while all of us have been engaged in very significant progress over the last few years to eliminate extreme sentencing for young people still are languishing in prison for decades, even in cases where no one was killed. Even though all of us have worked very hard to start to dismantle the gang database, still 200,000 people are labeled as gang members, and anyone over the 18 without any opportunity to appeal it, and anyone under the 18 without a real opportunity because of the failure of law enforcement to implement fully Senate Bill 458. Even though we've worked so hard to redirect resources away from prisons and jails, still we continue to be the largest incarcerator in the world, and even LA County, where we lock up more people than any place else in the world, has a $2.3 billion jail expansion plan that's moving forward at a time when our violent crime rates are at their lowest level since the 1950s. So what would it mean to have a state that went back to 1980? Imagine if California in 2016 had 12, not 33 prisons, and 26,000 people in the state's prison system rather than the 136,000 we have. Imagine if young people had access to summer and after-school jobs programs as they did in 1980. Imagine if youth centers, and many of you were probably members of teen posts. Imagine if youth centers existed throughout the state, which didn't exist for any of us coming up after 1980. Imagine as if in 1980, California was #1 in school spending and had the best public schools and community colleges and university system in the world, where people came from around the world to study our system. As opposed to now when we're #1 in prison spending, number 47 in school spending, and number 51 in spending for higher education. Imagine if we went back to 1980 before we had life sentences for youth as young as 14, many times driven by gang and gun enhancements, where the sentences are so extreme, even in cases where no one was killed, that young people are looking at hundreds of years in some cases. And with the advent of Senate Bill 9 and Senate Bill 260 and 261, those young people are still looking at their first parole hearings after 25 years. Imagine if we could erase 1980 to 2005, when California built 21 prisons and only 3 universities. And imagine what our generation would feel and what our generation would be accomplishing if people had invested and believed in our ability to go to college instead of expecting our ability to go to jail and prison. So my goal for all of us, as I talk about these young people that are YJC members and YJC members' family members, is that we'll try to go back to the future, that there's many answers we had in 1980 that we've left behind. So in thinking about the testimony today, I was really struck one day when I was in the car, and everyone from California, especially from LA, knows you spend a lot of time in the car. And the radio was talking about emergency room physicians, and they were talking about these meetings that they have every Monday morning where they analyze the deaths in the hospital from the week before. And I was like, how amazing is that? I've never heard of probation department, I've never heard of youth centers, I've never heard of schools talking in a very strategic, very analytical way, also with heart, about the people we'd lost the week before. I know for us at the Youth Justice Coalition, we've been to 57 funerals in 4 years. Those are just our members and our family members, loved ones who we've buried. So for us, it just becomes going to more funerals and graduations. What would it mean if we actually sat down and looked at each life and what lessons it has for us? So that's what I'm trying to do today in my comments. So Leonard Baker was back in school at 17. He had been through probation and had been arrested, but he's doing well and looking really forward to going to college. He started to apply to community colleges. But at the same time, his mom was suffering severely from a mental condition, and Leonard was really expected to hold down most of the income for his family. He was found outside a house, it was never determined why, at night, and a homeowner came up from behind him and shot him in the back of the head. What was most disturbing to us, who were his friends at school, but also family members who were in school with him, was that he was called a hero not only by the neighbors that commented on what had happened, but also by major media in LA County. So this is what Leonard, when he was alive, said he and other young people needed. And all these young people, with the exception of Ezel and Jesse, were a part of a 50-mile march that young people do every year, where they interview residents across LA County about what would really solve public safety and crime issues. And Leonard, like many of these young people, their number one focus was on jobs. That in 1980, it was easier to find a job than a gun, and that from 1980 on, that was severely reversed. That the only jobs we have in most of our neighborhoods are in the underground economy. So these are our top 3 recommendations coming from the streets and lockups of LA County. That every state and county lockup have a community college, community-based organization, and a union as their key partners. Not in coming in once in a while to work with young people, but fully involved in the running of the facility. And that every young person and every adult leave lockup with a union apprenticeship, a paid internship, or a paid job ready for them when they go home, as well as all their IDs and transcripts so they can immediately transition back into their home community. Second, to guarantee every youth in the state whose family falls below the poverty line an after-school and summer job, as many states now do, but California has languished far behind. And as one example of that, New York City is about comparable in size to LA County, has 50,000 summer jobs a year. LA County has about 8,000. Third, address in a real way the discrimination and exclusion of all of us who have particularly felony convictions, but even misdemeanor convictions. And I think we've gone a long way in banning boxes, but that only gets you into the door for the interview. So what does it mean when you're on the front lines of forest fires throughout the state as a prisoner? And it's mostly our folks in prison that are putting out those forest fires and saving mostly wealthy people's homes throughout the state. But you come back to your county and you can't even apply for a city or county firefighter job. And you can only work for a service where the conditions, the pay, and the life expectancy is the lowest. Imagine that you're cutting hair inside a jail or a prison and you can't even cut hair in the community because you're barred from that regarding certification. Regarding anything that requires bonding, you're permanently barred for life. It means for all of us, even with low-level felonies, we're pretty much, if we want even a barely living wage, stuck in the underground economy, as I believe Leonard was. Chris Carter walked out of school, also had really been pushed to become part of a neighborhood because his father was notorious. And I think that's something we don't talk about, that many of these young people, by the time they're 10, 11, 12, we've seen homicides in our own families, in our own streets, in our own communities. But Chris had really left the streets in many ways. He had transitioned, or was beginning to transition out of probation. He was back in high school. And he left high school one day because a girl that he had a crush on hurt his feelings. There was no intervention worker in his school to track him down in the streets. There's no intervention workers working those blocks, street by street, to engage young men that are on the corners during school hours or during work hours. And Chris was caught in a drive-by. He wasn't armed. He wasn't doing anything, and was killed on the street that day during school hours. So these are our recommendations of what would have kept Chris alive. We need to remove, as maybe this might be hard to think about because it's become so routine in our schools, but it's been a fairly recent phenomenon that our schools look and operate like prisons. That you walk through razor wire and security gates. That you're routinely pulled out of class by drug-sniffing dogs or armed officers who search your backpacks and pat you down. That oftentimes those searches happen within a classroom. And that a young man like Chris, who's already on probation, that is consistently under probation in his schools, ends up leaving school a lot of the time or getting kicked out of school. Similarly, Chris was one of those young men that comes home from camp, probation camp, and is barred from entire districts just because of their convictions. And so Assembly Bill 1276 that we worked very hard on changed that, but implementation of that county by county, district by district needs to be real. Similarly, we have more police officers in our schools than we do counselors. And for young people who are system involved, but for all young people, it's particularly frightening to have your only interaction be with police when what you really need is a mental health worker, intervention worker. So we're really pushing to dismantle the war on gangs, to replace gang databases and gang injunctions and the permanent labeling of young people with intervention workers in our schools and streets that provide safe passage and help young people to adjust to the trauma that they face every day. Further, we hope that Senate Bill 458 will become real, and we're working with Dr. Weber this year to bring a new bill to you that will take those protections to people over 18, but also make those protections much more bold. And finally, in replacing school police with intervention workers, that we also take military-grade weapons out of schools. The idea that Compton, that Fontana, that LA Unified has rocket launchers and AK-47s for school police is not only ridiculous, but sends the wrong message to young people who are saying to choose peace over war in the streets. Finally, we're asking that you audit local sheriffs and probation departments, because as much was said in the previous panel, millions of dollars that was supposed to make it to the community for community-based intervention programs is not making it there and is languishing in probation. When probation was found out to have $21 million that was supposed to go to the community in LA County, they ensured the community that it was better spent on putting probation officers in junior high schools to work as counselors with young people that hadn't even been arrested yet. And I think we gave out data that there's a lot of studies now that prove that even small contact with the system pretty much secures your future as headed for jail or prison, as opposed to young people who are living in the exact same environments but don't have that contact with the system. Gustavo Jaimes had left the street entirely, had escaped from the underground economy, was raising his new baby girl. He was on his way to a job interview and was really excited. And he scraped money together to try to get on the bus. But he didn't have quite enough. And so the first bus passed him up. It was a woman who was standing with him at the bus stop that saw him get hit up by what she felt like was a rival neighborhood or someone that was angry with him or recognized him, and ended up killing him right there at the bus stop. If you took just a fraction of what LA County and other counties spend to have the sheriffs check people for their bus passes and metro passes, for LA County that's $110 million a year just for the sheriffs to check for bus and metro passes. That means you see a lineup at our buses and trains of young people, almost all entirely young people of color, trying to prove that they have adequate pass to get on the trains. Less than 20% of that budget could provide a free metro pass for all students in LA County, preschool through college. And people like Gustavo and Chris and Leonard wouldn't be sweeping their floors or going through their couches to try to find fare to and from school. There's also a bill before you by Hertzberg that we're very excited about. We worked hard to eliminate fare evasion as a punishment for young people in LA County. We hope that will go statewide. But we don't believe that public transportation should be a criminalizing offense. And that when people have access to jobs and health centers and schools all over their county, in addition to everything else that their counties have to offer, then their future is much more hopeful. Jesse Reynoso was absent for school and suffering meth addiction and a mental condition. It might have been onset by meth. It could have been an early onset of schizophrenia. And he killed himself with a handgun in his family's home, again, during school hours. His little brother was in our school, and we tried numerous times to try to get him into drug treatment because this meth addiction was well known to his family. And we couldn't find any drug treatment that could take him because he didn't have the correct medical coverage. For our families, and you're going to hear from a lot of folks that are going to describe this, even the idea that you can get into drug treatment when you need it, which is immediate, is an impossibility. Jesse's little brother, Luis, came home to find his brother in the house. And Luis has also now battling addiction, and I think it's directly tied to the fact that he knew his brother was suffering, he feels he's responsible, and he found his brother. California also is last in the nation in the ratio between students and counselors in our public schools, with one counselor for every 1,012 students. So it wasn't just anecdotal when I said that we have more police officers and probation officers in our schools than counselors. And those are just the counselors that are supposed to help you navigate your credits and make sure that if you're absent from school, someone's trying to track you down, which doesn't happen. We have even less school psychologists or mental health workers, which young people need so much access to. Finally, Ezell Ford he was a friend of Brandy Brown's family. Brandy lived on his block and knew him for several years. And Ezel, like so many YJC members and so many residents throughout California, again, almost always black and brown youth, was stopped regularly by LAPD. They knew him by name. They knew he had a mental condition. They might not have known that he was bipolar, but they definitely talked about him as having a mental condition because they called him names based on that. And it was a gang unit that stopped him regularly, even though Ezel was not gang involved. Because of the block he lived on, that was the unit that rolled that block every day. 3 days before he was killed, they had a gun out on him and had him sitting on a couch that was on the sidewalk, just laid out on the sidewalk. So they had even those same exact officers that confronted him even 3 days before. We want, in terms of Ezel Ford, and now the 654 people just in LA County alone who have been victims of homicide as a result of use of force, to push for these changes. First, we have a family rights platform so that young people and adults, when they're killed by police, that their families are notified in an immediate and respectful way. They don't hear about the passing in the media. They don't hear about the passing or the killing by neighbors. They don't hear about their loved one being recriminalized in the media. Oh, they were a gang member. They were on parole or probation. They had a gun. Oftentimes those things are not true. But if they are ever corrected, they're corrected quietly weeks later. We want mental health responders as the first responders whenever someone either has a known or suspected mental condition. We know that in white communities, in middle class and upper class communities, these stops are slow, elongated, prolonged. But with houseless population, whether white or people of color, and with all people of color in our communities, when there's a mental health challenge, these stops and these shootings happen within minutes. We don't understand the rush for that. We saw, and we handed out the data to you too, where in 7 cases in LA County, people were threatening suicide. Their loved ones called law enforcement, and law enforcement ended up killing the person that was threatening suicide. And similarly, at least we think about 20%, based on data we got from the coroner's office, of the people killed in LA County had a mental condition. Similarly, we don't understand the overuse of firearms, the over-reliance of firearms. When we run a community center and have to deal every day with people, you know, we have to talk them down out of stress, talk people out of fights, take knives from people, and we are not armed with anything, not even pepper spray. So we encourage those same skills and that same attention with law enforcement. And we hope that AB 953 implementation is real, that it doesn't just become a paper law. We're so excited, all of us in this room who work to push it and pass it, and so thankful for all your work as legislators to pass it, but we hope that it's a real implementation. Finally, no one on the ground argued that we should have body cameras or more police training. Those were solutions that came from legislators across the country and from the White House. What families on the ground who've buried loved ones due to law enforcement have consistently asked for is an independent prosecutor. In LA County, we've met with the DA several times. She's now released all the letters to us of all the cases that they've had going all the way back to 2000, and not a single case has been prosecuted. We don't feel that local district attorneys, and this is something that's shared across the nation, who have to rely on local law enforcement for all their other cases, are in a place where they can also prosecute police misconduct, police use of force. So as we leave you with these young men, all of whom deserve to be here today, we urge you to go back to the future. If we just think about 1% redirection of the state's prison budget, and to halt the mission slide of the little bit of money that does hit our ground, hit our streets, going also to law enforcement, to police and probation, who regularly see themselves now as the mental health workers, as the youth workers, but instead champion those mom and pop shops, but also those really well-established youth programs that have been doing this work and community programs for decades. Just 1% of the state's prison budget could offer so much. If we took 10% of the state's prison budget, that would be 5,000 intervention workers across the state, peace builders to hold down peace in schools and in the streets. 500 youth centers, each with a $500,000 a year budget, open from 3 p.m. to midnight, which is what is invested in other parts of the country, and in some places here, most notably Oakland and San Francisco. And 250,000 youth jobs, with just 10% of the state's prison budget. In addition, any prison or jail construction bond moving forward, or bill that proposed to put more money toward prison and jail construction, just a small change in that to also allow that money to also go toward community-based alternatives to arrest, detention, incarceration, so we could build up the alternatives in our community would be a huge change. We argue for a moratorium on construction, given the fact we have more prisons than universities and more jails than community colleges in most of our counties. We ask that a moratorium really go into effect until study on the issue is done, until we really exhaust all the options we have for split sentencing, for release on OR, for bail reform, for releasing people on low-level misdemeanors, that we could solve our overcrowding situations by doing that instead. And finally, we want to know where the peace dividend is. When communities have worked so hard to reduce their homicides throughout the state and throughout the nation by more than half, where we have homicide levels at their lowest levels since the 1960s. Each homicide in California costs about $1 million to investigate and $17 million total when you think about court and incarceration costs. So the 50% of those homicides that are no longer happening in our community, where's the $17 million on each of those homicides that instead of sitting with law enforcement should be redirected as a peace dividend back to communities? Thank you. And for Ezel and Chris and Leonard and Jesse and his family, we really thank you for this time, and I wish they had delivered this message instead.
Thank you, Ms. McGill, for your thoughtful and insightful words and for sharing with us those very powerful stories. I want to acknowledge and welcome, acknowledge the presence of and welcome Assemblymember Scott Wilk, Select Committee member. And we can go now to Mr. Galvis. Welcome, Mr. Galvis. Unless you want to go in another order.
I'll yield to a colleague, Elizabeth Calvin.
Okay.
Ms. Calvin.
Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Calvin, and I work with Human Rights Watch in the Children's Rights Division. And for many years now have worked on the issue of youth being given extreme prison sentences in the adult system. And I'm going to focus just on one issue, an issue where the state makes the decision to not invest in a child or a young person's life. And that's when the state decides to remove a child from the juvenile system and send him to the adult system. Last week, you may have heard Governor Brown announce his support for a ballot measure. And most of the press coverage of that focused in on two important elements of that ballot measure, one being the possibility of changing credits for people who are in prison, and another piece would change the parole process for some people who are in prison. But what wasn't covered for the most part is something that would dramatically change how young people are treated. And this piece of the ballot measure was drafted and and input was given from community members, activists, and people who have experienced the system themselves. And Governor Brown relied on that information in order to craft the content of the ballot measure. So I'm going to talk about that for a moment, because since 2003, in California, 10,000 youth have been removed from the juvenile system and tried as adults. And what that means is they have been denied the services, treatment, education that is available in the juvenile system and put into the adult system, where you can look in the penal code. The stated purpose of the adult prison system is punishment. And this is really nothing short of an attempt to throw away the life of that young person. For all of the problems we have with our juvenile justice system, it is the right place to be dealing with issues when young people commit serious crimes. In 2003, which is the most recent data that I have, currently in prisons in California are 6,500 people who were under the age of 18 at the time of their crime and as young as 14 years old. Every one of them was removed from the juvenile system and put into the adult system. And the vast majority of them their case was put into the adult system by the decision of a prosecutor. California is one of only 15 states in the country that give discretion to prosecutors, not judges, to decide where the case of a young person is filed. And under California law, Prosecutors do that with no guidance, no statutory direction, no appeal, no review. It is a decision that is wholly discretionary. And it's a decision that in most cases they have to make within 48 hours of the police report being filed. Prosecutors don't have access to any information at all about the young person's life, whether that young person suffers from mental health problems, has been exposed to trauma, has learning disabilities. They have zero information. It's a decision that is made in a vacuum, except for the information about the crime itself in the police report. 70 to 80% of the cases of youth who end up in adult court end up there because a prosecutor made the decision. But even in the remaining cases where a judge makes the decision, California law is so flawed that really judges are not able to make a decision using their discretion. Now, don't get me wrong. If we're going to decide to send young people to the adult system, a judge should be making that decision. We want someone who is unbiased, who has the time and the resources, the training, the duty to examine what is best for a young person and for the community, to listen to psychologists, to examine the record, to hear from victims, and make the right decision for that young person and the community. But the way that so-called fitness hearings are done right now, judges are highly restricted. And I'll tell you the story of Bobby G., who at age 16 was addicted to drugs and was fully involved in a gang. He was involved in a murder of a rival gang member. He was not the shooter. He was very, very intoxicated at the time of the incident. He had no prior criminal involvement. And when he went, and he had a hearing with the judge, and when he went before the judge went through the 5 criteria. And on criteria 1, he was found to be fit for juvenile court. And criteria 2, he was found to be fit for juvenile court. And 3 and 4, and the judge read a psychological report where a psychologist had found that Bobby was developmentally delayed and was operating at the mental and emotional level of a 9-year-old, despite being 16 years old. But when the judge got to the 5th criteria, which was the gravity of the crime, and let's just be real, every crime that goes into one of these hearings is serious, the judge had to say, "I'm sorry, I have to send you to the adult system." And Bobby was sent to the adult system and was tried as an adult and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Those are the kinds of restrictions that are in current law. This is a decision that is costly. It's costly in human life. What Bobby and the other 6,500 people currently in California prisons have gone through, going into prison at a young age, 17, 18, facing older adults in prison and highly violent situations, being much more likely to be assaulted than older prisoners, much more likely to be raped than older prisoners, much more susceptible to the persuasions of prison gangs. That is human cost. When we give up on a young person like Bobby, that is human cost. But there are financial costs as well. When you sentence someone at age 18 to 25 or 50 years to life, we pay every year to hold them in prison, regardless whether they grow up and change and turn around and give up the gang life and change from being a 15-year-old to a 30-year-old or a 25-year-old who is looking at the world in a very different way. And finally, there is extensive, well-regarded research that shows if you take a young person, 2 young people who have committed the same crimes and come from the same social history, and you put one in the juvenile system and you put one in the adult system, the one who goes into the adult system is much more likely to commit more crimes in the future. This ballot initiative would help turn this back. It would make it so that only judges make the decision about whether a young person goes into the adult system or not, and it would give judges the tools to really consider all of the relevant facts. It's an important step in the right direction, and I hope everybody in this room supports its passage in November. But there's so much more to be done that could be done by this body, and in particular, when we talk about investment of funds, the importance of making juvenile court a place that is healing, a place that gives young people opportunities, but even more importantly than that, investing in community-based groups that are giving young people the tools they need to never walk through those doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Calvin. Let's go to Mr. Galbis.